everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Everything Design podcast. And today I have Maria Del Mar, who is a friend of mine, and I've met her about 2 or 3 years ago. And we were connected by our ex-professor, Dory Tunstall. So just to give you a little bit of background on Maria, Maria actually graduated from Columbia in industrial design and within a specialization for product development. And she's been all over the world. She came from Colombia. She's been she worked in the States, in UK, went to Australia, went to China. Now she's in Singapore, and she will be going to Europe as well. So she's very international. Yeah, and I think she's I thought it'd be quite cool to have her share, and we can have a quick discussion for this podcast, I think, which will be useful for people who are thinking about how design actually is impacted by culture, right? Because culture is something that we are constantly engaging with, and we're constantly trying to figure out how we want to identify and be able to define what culture is for a person. And I think having to be able to speak to Maria with her experience around the world, I think that's something to really be excited about. So I'm very excited for today's podcast. So let's welcome Maria. Hi Maria. Yay. Hi.
Yay! Hello, Nicholas.
Yes.
Thank you for inviting me. This is really nice. I mean, I never did this, so but it's really nice to share my personal experience and my perspective as a designer, traveling around as a family, but how I still having that view of and like design process in my mind, and how I see everything that I experience when I go around.
So I guess what we could start off with is maybe Maria, why don't you share with us a little bit on your career? I mean, you've traveled really around the world. You've been working in the fashion industry for many years. Maybe you can just give our listeners just a little bit of a taste of what Maria has been doing throughout her design career.
Yeah. So I study actually I want to start because we were talking a little bit about culture, that I forgot to mention you before, but I'm from Colombia, South America, and actually within Colombia I'm a little bit of a mix, because my father is from the north of Colombia, which is a different culture, different backgrounds, and my mom is from the south of Colombia, which was the capital of the colonial nation, right? So even in Colombia, it was a little bit of a mix. And then we live in a city that is the textile and the fashion city in Colombia, and actually very important city in South America. And then we live there. I study in the university. It's called Universidad Pontificia Bolivariana. It's UPB. And then I studied industrial design, but then I took some subjects of product development. That's the way I see it. It was more about management of product, and to consider in fashion and the product that, I mean, clothes as a fashion, as a industrial design, as an object, right? So I studied that, and of course, because it was a textile city, I immediately, once I finished, I started working in the design teams. Of course, starting as an assistant, and then I started moving around to different companies. But basically, it was more creating collections for the Colombian market, more inspired, of course, on the trends, especially we in Colombia are very Americanized. So yeah, so taking all the trends and visiting Europe and the States for different fairs to check the market, and almost a little bit of a copy paste, but adapting the product to our bodies, because Colombians were more curvy, and the colors, of course, are more. We like bright colors. We don't have seasons, so for us, we live in the tropic, and then we need to be changing all the time. There is no seasons for us to change our mood. We have to change it ourselves, so trends are quite important. And then after that, like many years working on that industry, I went to China to work for a Colombian retail company, and I started working more on the production side, like looking for suppliers, visiting all the factories. Yeah, it was a completely different experience for me. But of course, the Colombian company wanted to have a person that wanted to have the experience, but that had the taste and knew the market of Colombia. So for me, it was easy to find a supplier because I knew, oh, this will work really good in Colombia and things like that. So I lived in China for 4 years, and it was a great experience. I live in Shanghai, so I I think I immersed a little bit in the culture, because I had to go to different places that even now I don't even remember how I arrived there, like by boat, by train. I experienced a little bit in China how the change of the train system. Like I remember we had a train from Shanghai to Hangzhou that it was 3 hours, and it was, I remember, I still have the picture. One day I will show it to you. It was a beautiful pink train with the curtains, like it was really like from a movie. And then of course, before we left, it was only half an hour train, the super modern train. Anyway, so it was an amazing time, because I went to different places, small villages, how they were also changing from being more like a production in house to becoming a big company. And that was a very nice experience. It was a big adventure for me, with the food, the culture, how even the language, how to understand. I didn't speak Chinese, of course. I still don't speak Chinese. I understand a lot. And for me, also talking about culture and design, I think being creative makes makes it a little bit easier, because maybe it's not that you are open mind to everything, because some things really are like, oh my god, this is not my culture. But I think being creative, I always say, you start seeing beauty in everything. So of course, I start taking a lot of pictures of textures, of colors, and it was really a nice experience for me. It was sometimes difficult from my culture point of view, but it was a really nice experience. Then after being in China, actually, I met my husband, that is Dutch, and then again is a little bit of a culture mix, and how to understand from a personal perspective, like, and how we have so many similarities, and how we have so many things that are completely opposite, like emotions. Colombians or South Americans, we know Latinos are more happy, more extrovert, and more emotional. While Northern Europeans are maybe more rational and more practical. But yeah, here we go. We still married today. Then from there, we went to Australia. We live in Sydney for another 4 years, and I work in two companies. One is Bendon, that is underwear company. I don't know if I can mention names.
It's okay. Yeah, we will
It's okay.
yeah, we will not Just to make sure we don't get into any
Eh,
trouble. Yeah. 2 years work for 2 companies. Yes. In
yeah.
Australia. Yeah.
And then in the other company, I was working for being the fabric coordinator. So I was developing all the fabrics for menswear and women's wear, being part of the design team. And again, for me, was being in a country, first of all, having seasons, again, more mild than in China, but it was very nice. And of course, it was being in, I mean, of course, it's not Asia, but it being on this side of the world, being in East, but having that Western culture. And it's for me, Australia was really like, wow, this is incredible how they are here in the middle, of course, all the history of colonization and everything, but for me it was really interesting. and and then I decided to explore a little bit, because at the beginning actually it was a little bit difficult for me to get a job. And then because it was difficult, I decided, okay, I'm going to look to study for something, to study. And I found this program in Swinburne University online, the design anthropology, and that's how we met, thanks to Dory Tunstall,
Yeah.
which is amazing teacher. I think you were actually at that time also my teacher, and in the online classes.
Yes,
I think
yes.
so. You were the assistant of
The
Dory
TA, the
Tunstall.
TA. Yes, I was. Yeah.
And then, yeah, for me it was also like a big opening of my mind studying that, because I was like, oh, this is why I study design. Actually, before I studied design, I wanted to be an anthropologist.
Oh, okay. I didn't
Then
know that.
I studied design because it was kind of like, oh, I found in the career and the project they had in the all the subjects they have, that it was, I don't know, I feel attracted. I feel like this is what I want. And I always see design more for the people and how people use things, and solving problems and generating ideas for me has been always a part of the creativity. And I really like that. And yeah, culture always attract me, right? Okay, and then from Australia, we went back to Colombia. After 8 years being out of Colombia, I came back, and for me was rediscovering my own country. Like in 8 years, of course, completely changed. It develops more places that were not dangerous anymore, and it become like a tourist attraction. I was not that Latina anymore. I recognize as well how I get all these cultures attached to me in a way, like being, of course, with a Dutch guy, living in here and there. Of course, it creates like I always say, like a quilt. Like I'm a quilt.
You're adding the
I'm
pieces.
a little bit of everything.
Yeah, you're adding different pieces to the quilt, and your quilt is constantly growing, right? That's sort of the saying. Yeah, actually, I mean, the description that the story that you've just told is a long story. I mean, it's there's so many points and so many things that we can really unpack from that. But I think just going back to the last point that you spoke about, which I think it's something quite interesting. Maybe we can discuss about that a bit. Which is, I think, which is about culture, right? And how we ourselves identify, because you are somebody who was born in Colombia, grew up there, and then you left Colombia for about 8 years, and then going back again, and then you talk about it's almost you feel like a different person, and your identity is sort of different as well. Do you think that through traveling, and not just traveling for leisure, but traveling for migration, in a sense, to move to somewhere for a long period of time, how do you feel that really opens up your eyes to the world that you were living in the past, and even to the new worlds that you are engaging with? Do you think that plays a big part in who you define yourself as today, culturally, I guess?
Totally. Like, also, I look back when I left Colombia, when I started having my first house in Colombia, like living alone, I remember I like Asian things, but it's of course an idealization of what Asian is, right? Like it's more like China or the chopsticks or things like that. And I look back and I was in love with that. And then being now, I mean, in all these different places and recognizing myself as well, like part of it, and that we are all one. Uh, I mean, we of course our cultures are different, but there is always a lot of similarity, and I see it in the food, I see it in the way we dress up. I even have sometimes a very strange experience when I arrived in China. That for me was all new. That I start seeing people that was like, oh, this is very similar to my mom, but in the Chinese version. You know, that we all have this, like, you know, it's like if we have these doubles around, and then, but obviously, yes, I am. I don't know who I am anymore, but I'm pretty sure I'm a little bit, because if I go to Colombia, I'm not that Colombian. I don't have long hair. I'm not that Latina anymore. Then I love all uh, the shapes of East, like of more of the East, like boxy, talking about clothes, and the colors more neutrals, and all that minimalist kind of aesthetic. And then back in Colombia, of course, that is not the thing. So for me, I consider that I'm a mix.
Yeah.
And sometimes it's difficult, depends on where you are, that defines you, not only for your culture but also your race. We were talking, of course, about if I'm and I'm pretty sure now that I'm going to move to Holland, maybe here I look really white, but I'm pretty sure in Holland I'm going to look really exotic. Like you're going to be more brown. Right?
Yeah.
So I know every time I move around, I become another me, because it shifts a little bit.
I mean, the I think the interesting thing that you know, you before we were recording the podcast, I think we discussed a little bit about, I think, the racial aspects of it, right? I mean, you have your nationality, you're born in Colombia, I was born in Singapore, but it's purely on the, I think, the racial aspect, you know. You know, interesting to hear you tell me that, you know, when you did the test, that you actually found that you have some, you know, indigenous blood, some African blood as well, you know, based on your heritage as well, and it's also very interesting now that we're always seeing a lot of people who are mixed, and it really is a spectrum, right? It's a spectrum in terms of all these different types of people that are out there, right? Even if you talk about, you know, East Asian, you know, I think the American or sometimes the Australian perspective, right, is, oh, you're all from China, right? But I think when I went over to Australia, I think the number one challenge that I had always was to just remind people that I was not from China. Not that I had anything against the Chinese, but I think it was just that the fact that I wanted to feel like identify myself
for who you are.
Yeah, exactly, as a Singaporean, right? Like I was born and raised as a Singaporean. I look like, you know, my Chinese cousins, you know, who were from China. Sometimes I may even look like a Japanese person or a Korean person, to the person who has not a lot of exposure to that, right? But I think that spectrum is a very interesting thing, and I think nowadays, even in today's context, you know, especially with what's happening in the States, you know, what's happening around the world, where everybody's protesting about, you know, the racial violence, the violence in in the States. I think this question of, are you brown, are you black, are you yellow, are you white, to what degree, right? And I think the Mexican, recently the Mexico did an ad, about traveling to the States, and they had this very interesting campaign, right? Which they went to interview a lot of the Southern Americans, and they were to say, how much the percentage of your DNA blood, right? How much Latino or Mexican blood you have will give you a percentage. Will give you the amount for your free trip to Mexico, and it's like, a lot of these people that were interviewed, they look, very, very Caucasian, very white, right? But they had, some of them had like 30% or 40% of Mexican blood in them, which was, I think it's very, for us to talk about race nowadays. I think, as this culture is, constantly expanding, and the world is constantly, mixing around, you're such a great example, right? You're coming from from Colombia, you went to China, and then you met your husband who's Dutch, and you have a kid who's mixed, right, in that sense, and whether we trace your child's DNA back, it will, I'm sure you will have such a mix of things, right? You'll have European, a bit of African, indigenous, South American blood as well, and I think that's something that we need to consider. And I think nowadays also, when we apply that culture back to design, right, it's I think identifying that things are not so clean cut, right? We can't just design things for everybody. I think the example that you have for the clothing line, right? What's beautiful, that's perceived in, let's say, France or the Europes, right? In Europe, it needs to be, even if it's brought into, Colombia, it had to be catered to that local culture. And I would imagine the local culture that we're talking about is not just local culture to Colombia, right? You were talking about how Colombia has the northern section, the southern section, and then maybe the central, and what each, I guess, area perceives as beautiful, or in terms of aesthetics purpose. I think also I'm sure there's a variety of that, right?
Totally. I remember working in fashion, of course. The color becomes really important, and since we don't have seasons, it becomes more like a commercial season, right? Like, of course, Christmas is a very important time of the year, but then colors are important, and we have a lot of green. And I think it's something that more or less like same here as in Singapore. And I think you guys don't wear too much green.
We will blend in with our trees on the streets.
In Colombia, a part that is very green, the police uniform is green.
Okay.
So when we try to sell green, is really a bad color. I mean, just an example how even the colors are, even if it was an international trend and the green is amazing. Of course, that changed a little bit more because people are like, oh, I don't care that anymore. But I don't want to look like a police, not because it's something against, but it's, of course, is color, of course, becomes also like a hierarchy, and yeah, it's so funny how all these little changes in every country for color or for patterns, and even like I was saying, of course, boxy silhouettes are more accepted here because Asians are more skinny, while when you are curvy and you want to show, of course, everything is more tight in Colombia. Everything is more tight to your body.
Yeah, so
So
you brought up a few points. Sorry, I think you brought up a few points about the boxiness. So maybe what would you say, to us Asians, what recommendations would you have for us from a fashion perspective, from your expertise as a person who's been working in fashion for all these years? Like what do you think us locals in Singapore or Asians need to think about when we're looking at fashion?
oh my God, that's a difficult question,
Difficult
Nicola.
question.
Because I really feel I love Asian fashion. I mean, I love the silhouettes. I love the. I mean, I'm talking about textiles and as well, and all the culture that you have, all the background, like wow, all the weaving patterns that Asian have is amazing. Like a kimono is the most beautiful silhouette that you could have. So for me, it's really I love it the way it is. I don't think for me it's more maybe like a mix. I
Mm,
will transform it maybe like a mix for myself.
mm.
But I love the way Asian fashion is. I won't change it.
That's good. That's good.
I mean, for some people, it's of course like, oh, it's they don't have big accessories. When in Colombia, is all big accessories, or the colors here maybe are more neutral, while in other places are more colorful or more bling bling. It's completely different, but like the sizes here are different, and of course, for me, even find something that fits me is difficult.
Yeah.
It's difficult because then yeah, my body is more curvy, and then I'm a big size here. Well, maybe now in Europe I'm going to be, oh, I'm small, I'm petite, I need to buy. So it's funny how that everything changes depends
On where you are,
on
right?
the position you are
Yeah, yeah,
and the
yeah.
culture you have and everything. So
Mm,
it's impossible. That's why I believe that more and more that is small brands that are focused on a niche are taking more importance,
mm,
because then if you identify, like again, if I identify myself with that culture, with that proposal, I will fall in love with that,
mm.
right?
Definitely,
So
definitely.
yeah.
Yeah, I mean the so I mean just going back on the fashion thing. I think the point that I thought to get your take on is I think fashion has been I think over the years there has always been this question of appropriation, right? Like
Yeah.
in the States, the indigenous the
Mm-hmm.
indigenous the Indians, right, they have their patterns, their specific patterns, and I think there were a few brands in Singapore, not in Singapore, in the States, that were appropriating those cultures, right? And I think
Yeah.
wondering from your, I guess from your perspective, as a person who's traveled around the world, all right, do you ever fear, I mean, if you ever do, I mean, when you do your designs in the past, when it's coming from one culture to another, did this idea of appropriation, was it something that you were worried about, or did you feel that no, actually, there is a respect for the culture that I'm learning from, and there's a respect from the
Mm.
culture that I am not taking, but I'm inspired by,
Mm-hmm.
and changing it to fit that appropriate context, and whether you felt that, because I think appropriation is something that's being discussed a lot, especially
Yeah.
the Black American culture. The people are saying that, oh, you
Mm-hmm.
cannot do your hair. Doing your hairstyle in a particular way may be culturally appropriating my culture. Or there
Yeah.
was a case I think in the States a few years back where this lady did a Japanese birthday party for her daughter, and I think and this cultural appropriation also came up, right? And
Mm-hmm.
also I think in Australia, while we were in Australia, there was a big thing about how indigenous Australian art was being appropriated for mass market
Tourists,
sales, and yeah,
souvenirs.
exactly, for
Yes.
tourism. And so I mean,
Mm.
as a person who's traveled around the world quite a bit, and
Mm.
dealing with design, did you ever feel like you this appropriation thing was something that you were worried about, or you felt that no, actually what I've done is fair, and the things that I did are respectful of the different cultures that I've been interacting with. Do you sort of feel that way?
Yeah, like actually, I have to confess that before I study design anthropology, for me was like, okay, this is the business, like I work for this. For me, was the norm. Somebody's teaching me this, and I was maybe very naive, and I was young, and I didn't understand. I didn't have the word. For me, it was like more. I was traveling, getting my job done, and come back. But after being more aware of culture and colonization concepts, and also putting myself in, oh, I'm colonized, or I'm colonizing when I'm doing design as well. And thanks to Dory, for me was like, wow, this is something that I never considered, and it really opens my mind. And after that, even when I travel, I really try to talk with the local people. Like if I'm going to buy something, I try to buy one, but that is very special for me to have as a treasure. No, like to, I mean, I'm for a good souvenir, but no, like the cheap souvenir, just because, oh, then I give it away. And then, because then I realize now more that, of course, somebody is not going to pay for that. Like the real person that is creating that, and what it means. We sometimes buy things that we don't even know what it means. Like in Colombia, we have this amazing hat. Actually, Dory has one, and the way we weave, it has different meanings. One is, of course, about nature and the animals or the water. Like in every culture, we recreate all that. And if you don't even know that, then of course is you're just buying another thing, and you're missing the story behind, and who made it, and what that person represent for that community, and why they like, for example, in Colombia, that they have all these weaving baskets and things like that. Why there is that material in that area. There is always a lot of background that when you travel is good to understand. And now when I travel, I try to talk with the people, why are you doing like that, and also ask them the questions, because I think, of course, in that, I understand in some countries that tourism is important. Of course, the locals want to sell, but also I try to give back the question, and who teach you this, and where do you get this, and how do you grandmom learn to do this, and also for them to appreciate that this is not just selling and buying. Of course, I understand as well that you need to survive, and this is a way of doing it, but also that they give the importance of what they are doing, and the story behind, right?
Yeah.
Like in the last time I went to Bali, we went to see this ikat factory.
Okay.
And it was beautiful to see it, but it's also like of course, it's a trade, but also how do you, I don't know, how do you approach the questions you ask? It's not just about, oh, I'm getting here, buying all this amount of pieces, but also telling them what this means, what is that color, what this represent, can I wear these? Like trying to be more aware of that you are a different culture, and that you need to ask that questions. I think it's also a little bit having respect for that. I think studying design anthropology really teach me that, and that was very nice.
Yeah, I think you spoke about 2 points. One, from the designer perspective, right? If we're creating something, we need to know what is the story behind it. We need to be able to identify what are the authentic aspects to it, right? What is real, what is not real, what is from a tourism perspective. And I think from a consumer perspective also, it's like when we're buying things now, I think things are so easy to buy, right? I mean, you go to AliExpress, you go to Amazon, you can buy. I mean, if I search on AliExpress, I'm sure I can find Colombian hat, right? But the Colombian hat would be made in China. It's not really from Colombia. And actually, it's I think those stories that are being tied to these specific objects that I think are quite important. And I think when we are designing or when we're buying things, I think we need to have that acknowledgement of where these items come from, what are the stories behind them, and I think to avoid any form of cultural appropriation, I think that respect needs to be made, and that acknowledgement needs to be made as well. And we need to be listening to the stories. I think one thing about consumeristic culture today, I mean, I have to admit that I'm part of it, right? I mean,
we're all a part of it.
it's very hard to take away. It's, I think, even now, we talk about even not just national culture, but I think there are different cultures like there are, like for some subcultures, like it's streetwear. Let's talk about, I mean, for example, streetwear, right? We talk about baggy clothes, if you think about the history behind that, all the ties with, hip hop, with music, with street culture, and that if we trace back, from the States, it also goes back to the cultural heritage and of the migrants or they have come from Africa and so on and so forth. I mean, we trace all the way back. There's so much.
You will wear it in a different way.
Exactly. So I mean, I think that's something to really, I think. I think that's something definitely to think about and consider. I mean, then the other thing I guess also would be, I mean, now that now that you've been traveling a lot, and you're going over to Amsterdam, right? If someone were to go to a new country, I mean, you've been to, you've moved to new countries so many times, right? I think from a cultural perspective, apart from of course your logistics, right? You need to worry about your furniture. You need to worry about and sending your children to a new school, applying for a new job, all these logistical stuff, right? But apart from the logistical stuff, when you do go to a new country and you're gonna move there, what do you feel are some of the things that a person would have to think about and consider before they go over there? What are some of the thought processes that you think, I think as a designer, you would advise somebody, if they were moving to a new country and whatever? I think what were some of the perspectives they need to consider and think of and look into?
For me, I have different rules as a person, as a family, but I think one of the most important is also play local. I mean, you can always find your community, because, like, for example, here in Singapore, I have my Latino community where we share food, we share that the traditions, celebrations, which are important because it's also you identify yourself. But everywhere in the world is different. Like the community here in Singapore is actually amazing. I mean, I found really good people. But also playing local is important, because otherwise you won't be able to learn the language or get to know really how people use things, and no manners in a way of doing something good or wrong, but just being more. It's almost like doing an ethnography trip and understanding what is acceptable and what are your limits as well. And I think that is very important, because then that opens a lot of doors for you. And that is also a way to understand the culture, and then it will be easier for you to adapt. And knowing that it's not you that are wrong, is that basically you're a guest and you're discovering a new country, and then just find for me it's almost an adventure and a surprise without judging. Because the problem is, and I hear this for many people, like, oh, but this is disgusting, I don't want that. It's okay, just take it. You don't need to get into that. It's just you try a little bit, you don't like it, it's normal. Maybe some local like it or don't like it, or it's too spicy, but at least try a little bit and and explore, and without that, without being judgmental, like just because it's different. It's just trying to, the position where you're looking from, it will give you a different perception. And then you just need to play a little bit local, and ask that questions, and then you will learn, and then it will be easier. It's actually, I always found that when you ask that questions like, what this means, or why you eat it, and how you eat it with, how do you eat this, or when do you eat this, and what do you celebrate, and what is behind that, people actually realize that not always have the answer, and then it's actually like a giving back a little bit of information too. Like, I'm pretty sure maybe the questions I did, some people immediately went like, I don't know what this means. Even because of course, I'm more tourist now in Colombia. Even now I have that. Oh yeah, we always have this, but I never knew the meaning. And I think that's important, to know your culture and to know the culture where you're going.
I think that's a very good point. I mean, this think local thing and be local. I think that it's not many people do consider that. I think even for me, when I first went to Australia, I think being local or trying to be local was something that was very helpful for me. Whether it was using the specific types of terminology, or doing the activities, right? That was very popular. Because in Singapore, I think for you as well, a tropical country, right? You're not gonna sit in the grass, right? No, it's too hot, right? It's too hot.
It's too hot.
Exactly. But in Australia, that was part and parcel, right? You will sit in the grass. You'll find a patch of, just under the shade, especially in front of the Melbourne Library. In front of the Melbourne train station, tons of people just sitting out there on the grass, and you're thinking, okay,
in Singapore maybe it's also not allowed neither, right?
Yeah, state,
But then it's also like two things, like the heat, and you don't even think about it.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that this idea of thinking local is a challenge, not easy, because it took me a while to I think really blend in with the Australian culture a little bit. I think Singapore and Australia, very globalized countries, but there are quite subtle differences. Even like getting used to the train system, getting used to how people were talking, ordering your food, right? What you're typically used to in terms of buying food or ordering food, even ordering drinks in that sense, or speaking to people or talking to people. I think the point you made about just ask questions. I think that's you're not sure, don't be shy. I think be curious about what is it that the culture is showing you. And I think it's also quite interesting, also when especially when you talk about how when we're so used to the things that we do, sometimes if people ask us, why do you do that? Then I've just been doing it. Yeah, I'm not really sure. I've just been
doing it. That's the way it is, but we don't know why.
Yeah, but I think that also, I think that plays a part to this whole cultural identity, right? Because the cultural identity that I think everyone has and identifies with is not just about your skin color, your nationality. But actually it's about the way we behave, the way we speak. I think linguistics, semiotics plays a big part.
Especially in Singapore.
Yeah, right. The way I think Singaporeans and Malaysians, the way we behave is very, very different.
Very different.
Yeah, and I think our behavior is a very unique selling point to us. It's weird. If somebody would ask me, how would you describe the Singapore culture, right? It's not easy for me, because I think there's quite a few dynamics to it. I wouldn't say it's easier for to describe the Colombian culture, right? I guess from a third person's perspective, like the Latin, the South American Latin, there's I think quite strong points about maybe music, about colors, about language. But I think when we break those things down, actually a lot of it really is the behaviors. How do we behave as people?
Yeah. Yeah.
We've been trained, I've been trained to behave this way as a Singaporean. And for 8 years, I was trained to behave like an Australian, right?
Yeah.
And I think for you as well, I mean, you've been
Yeah.
trained to, for 4 years as a Chinese, 4 years as an Australian, now 4 years as a Singaporean. I think I
Yeah.
think I do think culture is really impacted.
Behavior.
Yeah, behavior plays a very, very big part. Now that you
Yeah.
mention it, now that you talk about it, I think when we think back on it, it's not just about the color of your skin or the language I speak or the items that I own, right? Or the
Yeah.
hairstyle that I have. I think it really is the way we behave. It's
Yeah. And how we relate to, of course, the surrounding, and how do we follow rules or no, and how we behave.
Yeah, I mean,
And it's funny now that we're talking about this, because of course, if every time I move to another country, I feel that I'm a completely different person. Because of course, if I think about the person that I was in China, of course we always change and we age and we are different people, but the person that I was in China and the person that I was in Australia and the person I'm here in Singapore, and me being in Colombia before I left and after, and when I came back, it's a completely different person, and that's why I say, yes, I'm maybe sewing that quilt that I don't know how it's going to become at the end of my years, but then it really changes your behavior every time you go to a different place. You learn, and also how that behavior changes again, and how you forget. If I have to go to China again, I really forget all that behavior, how I need to behave. I forgot it. For me, it's already.
Yeah, and I think you're very where the behavior and personality is sort of different, right? I mean, the personality. I may be a very introverted person, but the way I behave to the cultural context, I think that plays a very, very big part. I think one example I can give to you is when I first moved back to Singapore, a few years ago, I noticed that my driving style changed very drastically. When I was in Australia, I didn't drive as aggressively. I wasn't a passive-aggressive driver when I was in Australia. I was driving, like normal, I wouldn't say I was speeding, or, I was trying to cut people off. But when I came back to Singapore, my behavior, the way that I drove was very different, because I had, if I wasn't aggressive enough as a driver here in Singapore, I wouldn't be able to come out to the corners. I wouldn't be able to notify people. I had to horn, things like that. So even I think that's the one thing that I think about when I think about culture and how culture plays a part in impacting us as human beings. And I think when I constantly think about it as a designer, right? I constantly think about okay, how do I really use a culture, and how do we design specifically to better these cultures? Because nowadays, when we think of design, it's not just about, I think, there are many different cultural groups. I cannot say, one way of designing for all Singaporeans, right? Or one way to design for all expats in Singapore. All expats in Singapore will or all migrants will think differently, because you have migrants who come from, Amsterdam, from Colombia, from the US, from UK, and I think their behaviors that they've picked up over here in Singapore and their personalities that they've built up here in Singapore is very, very different. I think that's very, very unique. And I think even for us, as we think about it, how do we as individuals learn about a new culture? You talk about the going local, right? I think also, like, when I learn from you, I consider myself as a local in Singapore, right? And I learn from you as a migrant who's coming here. I think that going local mindset also works quite well when I need to learn about your culture. And how you behave as a person in Singapore, so I think the context or the perspective we take doesn't matter. Like we can take a perspective from internally or a third person looking in, or from an internal context looking at somebody who's new to our culture. So I think the perspective is it's okay, but it doesn't matter too much. I mean, it gives us the variables or gives us differences, but I think the important part is to have that constantly have that mindset. I think the way you define it, I like it, which is to the thinking local, and to I think that thinking local part is very, very good. Staying curious. So I think that's good. I guess we was there anything else that you maybe wanted to share about I think your perspectives on
No, I
design and
think
how
that
culture
is,
is.
of course, also like we talked before about the difference and similarities. Yeah, that of course with all my trips, it's funny, of course, that sometimes you feel, oh, but this is Singapore, and even like that, being far away from Colombia, I still found some similarities. I mean, it's not that it's exactly the same, but you always find some behaviors that are similar, even if it looks in appearance different, but then is similar. Yeah,
Maybe
that's
maybe you can tell this similarity is like based off your own observations, right? What is one similarity that Singapore or Singaporeans have with Colombia or Colombians?
oh, Nicholas.
Tough questions. Okay, or maybe if you think about the differences, what's the biggest difference that you can think of from a cultural perspective?
I mean, there is for me, it's talking about security, for example, is a big difference. Colombia is not that safe, and that of course changes how we translate that in everything to be safe. The way we behave with the things we have. We never leave a bag on the table, and then of course here is completely the opposite, right? So then it's strange, like the first time when you're it's okay to leave it here, but maybe for you will be like, oh, you cannot leave it there. I'm like, we are in Singapore, who is going to take it? It's not that still people that maybe still here, but it's different. It's different, the feeling and how you become. And actually I experienced that I have to switch on and off that feeling of being aware every time I go back to Colombia, because it's like, oh, now I have to check that I don't wear this or I don't wear that, or that person is going to be good or not. It's really strange. Well, here in Singapore, I think it's a little bit more very relaxed. So you are not all the time in that attention mood.
Heightened senses, right?
Yeah, so that make it different.
I think similarities, we were talking about it before, which was you mentioned before the podcast about I think on the other day you were mentioning about this food dish, right? So you were saying that in Singapore we have this thing called bacang, right? Which is the rice in a sort of a banana. Is it banana leaf? Yeah, banana leaf wrapping, right? And they have
so basically you made a dough with the rice, and then inside you put pork.
Yes, pork
and the spices all something.
And there's there's a nut in there as well. It's a nut.
Great. And then we have something similar in South America, in all South America, but it's not only Colombia, that we call in Colombia tamal, and it's basically instead of rice we have corn. And we also use a lot of pork, like here. Maybe that's a similarity.
Yeah.
I mean, except, of course, the Malay people.
Yeah.
But the Chinese, of course, eat a lot of pork.
Yeah.
And then the way we wrap it with the banana leaves and everything, of course, the flavor is different. But I found it so similar that for me is like, oh, it's nice when you smell the banana leaves and the flavor that gives to the food. Even the ota, that is kind of like the ota is also kind of But the flavor that the banana leaves is a similarity that is, once you try it, even if it's a completely different food, it's something in your brain that tells you, oh, there is something there that you knew before. So yeah, I found that very similar. And also, like, even in the Peranakan colors or some tiles, and I'm really like, wow, this is almost like a little town in Colombia. I mean, I need to check more what exactly point will be, but there are many things, and like the combination of colors that for me reminds me a lot of that little towns in Colombia. And the houses that are painted pink with green, and it's not the same, but it has something that reminds you that combination of colors exists somewhere else.
Definitely. I mean, the food. I mean, the food wise. I mean, the tamales. That you know from I hear from about from the Mexican food, right? Tamales, and then for us the bacang, the dumplings, the rice dumplings that we have. I mean, I think you talk about otah. I think all of this is cooking with it's a cooking. With leaves, wrapping things with leaves. Our nasi lemak that we have here as well, right? You buy them and it's wrapped in that. Or we have some fish that we cook. You grill the fish with the banana leaves as well.
Also.
So I think it's a technique. Whether the technique was inspired or it's brought from one country to another, or maybe it could be a tropical thing, right? It could be a tropical thing that because of the trees that were being used. But I think these similarities are what brings us together, right? I mean, you talked about Australia being one of the first countries that the second country that you've been to, which has 4 seasons, similar as China, and I think it's important now that we have to identify what makes culture important for people and how people identify with the cultures, and I think also seeing those similarities and ensuring that we don't appropriate cultures, in that sense. But I think we can't avoid the similarities. The similarities are there. I mean, whether it's the bright use of colors from the Peranakan perspective, or even Indonesian batik prints, right? They have very, very strong use of colors, and the way that they mix the colors in as well. I think even and you talk about the some of the Chinese paintings as well. The patterns that are used for some of the furniture or some of the artwork that's there. So I mean, definitely, the aesthetics that we're seeing. I think there are the historians and the designs. Specifically, those design aesthetic scholars will be able to tell you what the similarities are, where these similarities come from. The food experts will also be able to tell you, what the differences are. But I think it is really, really important that we acknowledge the similarities that we have as a culture. And I think when we look at design, I think we can use these similarities to bring people together. I think, whether it's to communicate a message, there's a call to action. It's understanding what the similarities are and admitting that there are some differences. But I think using those similarities, it is a good stepping stone to really create things that are a bit more appropriate for people, to send messages out. I think we sometimes you see ads that are a little bit not necessarily very sensitive, or they could have been done a little bit better. I think that needs to bring in those those cultural sensitivities. It's not just to say the cultural sensitivities is to be fearful of, but I think we definitely can look at these cultural sensitivities as a point of connection, which I think is a good point that we have here. So I mean, I guess we'll end off here. I think it's been a thank you, Maria, nice. for your time. I think I have really sort of learned a lot about your journey as a designer. I think the different things that you were considering, and really when you're moving from one country to another, what were some of these things that you were able to learn and integrate into the work that you do. I think your perspective as a consumer as well as a designer definitely does help play a part and inform the decisions that you're making, as well as I think learning more about culture that does help quite a bit, and being being sensitive, sensitive to the differences and the similarities. I think we also spoke. I think the whole point about the being local, acting local part, I think is a good point, especially when we're talking about the use of ethnography. We learn about these methods, right? But to go into it, and to really apply it, that's a very, very hard thing to do. Like, if I'm a person who's very shy, I'm not gonna. It's very hard for me to go and build those connections with people and talk to people. It takes time to do all that. Yeah. So I guess thanks for your time. Thanks for coming on.
Thank you for inviting me, Nick.
Yeah, no, thank you very much. And so for the listeners, thank you for joining us on this episode of the Everything Design Show. And we'll see you at the next episode. All right, bye, Maria.
Sure.
Take care.
Okay, thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for everything.